The scorching African sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty plains outside Carthage, as General Marcus Atilius Regulus surveyed his vast Roman army stretching across the horizon. 86,000 of Rome's finest soldiers stood in perfect formation, their bronze armor gleaming like mirrors, their red plumes dancing in the desert wind. This was supposed to be Rome's moment of ultimate triumph, the decisive blow that would crush Carthage forever and secure Roman dominance over the Mediterranean. Regulus had crossed the sea with the largest invasion force Rome had ever assembled. The Senate had given him unlimited authority, unlimited resources, and unlimited expectations. Victory was not just expected, it was guaranteed. After all, what could a handful of Carthaginians do against the might of Rome? But as the morning mist cleared from the battlefield, revealing the enemy lines, something felt terrifyingly wrong. Where Regulus expected to see a desperate, outnumbered Carthaginian army making their last stand, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Only 1,200 Carthaginian warriors stood before them, led by a man whose very presence seemed to bend reality around him. Xanthippus the Spartan had arrived in Carthage just months before, a mercenary general whose reputation preceded him like the shadow of death itself. The Carthaginians, facing annihilation, had gambled everything on this one man. They had given him complete control of their forces, their strategy, their very survival. And now, as he stood before the Roman legions, his scarred face twisted into what might have been a smile, it became clear that this gamble was about to pay off in the most horrific way imaginable. The Romans had fought Carthaginians before. They had defeated them at sea, crushed their armies in Sicily, and now they had come to finish the job on African soil. But they had never faced anything like what was about to unfold. This would not be a battle in any traditional sense. This would be a masterclass in psychological warfare, a demonstration of how a brilliant mind could turn overwhelming numbers into a fatal weakness. Regulus raised his sword, the signal his army had been waiting for. 86,000 voices roared as one as they began their advance across the sandy plain. The earth trembled under their feet. Clouds of dust rose into the sky, and the thunder of their approach could be heard for miles. This was the sound of Roman might, the sound that had brought nations to their knees across the known world. But Xanthippus did not move. His 1,200 warriors remained perfectly still, arranged in a formation that seemed almost ceremonial in its precision. They were not arranged for battle as the Romans understood it. They were arranged for something far more sinister, something that would exploit every weakness in Roman military doctrine and turn their greatest strength into their ultimate doom. As the Roman advance continued, the first signs of Xanthippus's genius began to reveal themselves. The ground beneath the Roman feet was not what it appeared to be. The Spartan had spent weeks studying this battlefield, analyzing every grain of sand, every slope, every wind pattern. He had chosen this location not for its strategic value in conventional terms, but for its ability to transform a Roman advantage into a Roman nightmare. The soft sand that seemed so innocuous began to shift and give way under the weight of 86,000 marching soldiers. What had started as an organized advance began to slow, then falter, as Roman formations found themselves sinking into ground that seemed to swallow their feet with every step. The perfect Roman discipline that had conquered the Mediterranean began to crack as soldiers struggled to maintain their footing, their neat lines becoming ragged and confused. But this was only the beginning of Xanthippus's trap. As the Romans struggled with the treacherous ground, the wind began to change direction, carrying with it clouds of fine desert sand that stung their eyes and filled their lungs. The sun, which had been at their backs during the early morning advance, was now climbing higher in the sky, beating down on their bronze armor and turning each soldier into a walking oven. The weight of their weapons and armor, which had seemed so manageable in the cool dawn air, now became unbearable burdens as the temperature soared. Sweat poured down their faces, their breathing became labored, and their movements grew sluggish. The Romans, who prided themselves on their endurance and discipline, found themselves fighting not just an enemy, but the very elements themselves. And still, Xanthippus had not moved. His 1,200 warriors remained motionless, watching with the patience of predators as their prey exhausted themselves in the killing heat. This was psychological warfare at its most brutal. Every passing minute under that merciless sun weakened the Romans not just physically, but mentally. Doubt began to creep into minds that had known only victory. Fear began to replace confidence as the reality of their situation became clear. When Xanthippus finally gave the signal to attack, it was not with the wild charge that Romans expected from barbarian armies. Instead, his warriors moved with the calculated precision of a surgical strike, targeting the exact points where Roman formations were weakest, where confusion and exhaustion had created gaps in their defenses. The Carthaginian attack was unlike anything the Romans had ever experienced. These were not desperate defenders fighting for their lives. These were professional killers executing a plan that had been crafted with mathematical precision. Every movement had been calculated, every strike had been planned, every Roman weakness had been identified and exploited. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Roman soldiers who had expected to face a cornered enemy, instead, found themselves confronting warriors who seemed to know their every move before they made it. The Carthaginians attacked with a confidence that bordered on the supernatural, as if they could see the future and knew that victory was already assured. As the battle raged, the true genius of Xanthippus's strategy became apparent. He had not just planned for military victory, he had planned for psychological destruction. Every element of his attack was designed not just to kill Romans, but to break their spirits, to shatter their confidence, to make them question everything they believed about their own superiority. The heat continued to climb as the day wore on, and what had started as discomfort became genuine agony. Roman soldiers began to collapse from heat exhaustion, their heavy armor becoming death traps in the scorching desert sun. Water became more precious than gold, but there was none to be found on this carefully chosen battlefield. The soft sand that had slowed their advance now became a hellish quicksand that seemed to pull wounded soldiers down into the earth. Men who fell found it nearly impossible to rise again, their strength sapped by heat and exhaustion, their armor weighing them down like anchors. The battlefield began to resemble less a place of combat and more a vast, open-air tomb. But the physical torment was nothing compared to the psychological warfare that Xanthippus had unleashed. His warriors fought with a calm, methodical precision that was more terrifying than any berserker rage. They moved through the Roman ranks like death personified, striking with surgical accuracy and then melting away before the Romans could organize a response. The Romans, who had built their empire on the foundation of their military discipline, found that discipline crumbling under the relentless assault of heat, exhaustion, and fear. Orders went unheard in the chaos. Formations collapsed as soldiers sought shade or water that did not exist. And panic began to spread through the ranks like wildfire. Regulus watched in growing horror as his mighty army disintegrated before his eyes. This was not how battles were supposed to unfold. This was not the glorious conquest that had been promised. This was something far worse than defeat. This was humiliation on a scale that would echo through history. As the sun reached its zenith, the temperature on the battlefield climbed to levels that seemed to defy human endurance. The bronze armor that had protected Roman soldiers in countless battles now became instruments of torture, conducting heat until they burned the flesh beneath. Soldiers began tearing off their armor in desperation, abandoning the very equipment that had made them the masters of the Mediterranean. The sight of Roman legionnaires stripping themselves of their weapons and armor sent shockwaves through their own ranks. If their equipment was useless, if their training meant nothing, if their numerical superiority counted for nothing, then what hope did they have? The psychological impact was devastating, spreading panic faster than any physical assault could have managed. Xanthippus had created the perfect storm of psychological and physical warfare. His enemy was not just fighting his warriors. They were fighting the desert itself, fighting their own equipment, fighting their own growing despair. Every element of the battlefield had been turned against them, transforming their strength into weakness and their confidence into terror. The Carthaginian attacks became more precise and devastating as Roman resistance weakened. These 1,200 warriors moved like ghosts through the chaos, appearing wherever Roman defenses were weakest, striking with lethal efficiency and disappearing before organized resistance could form. They fought as if they could read Roman minds, anticipating every move, countering every strategy before it could be implemented. The Romans began to realize that they were not just outnumbered in terms of effective fighting strength. They were outclassed in every way that mattered. Their enemies fought with a unity and purpose that their own fragmented forces could not match. Where Roman soldiers struggled individually against heat and exhaustion, the Carthaginians moved as a single organism, each warrior supporting the others with seamless coordination. As the afternoon sun beat down with increasing fury, reports began reaching Regulus that were almost too horrible to believe. Entire Roman cohorts were surrendering without a fight, their soldiers too exhausted and demoralized to continue. Others were fleeing the battlefield entirely, abandoning their comrades in desperate attempts to escape the killing heat and the relentless Carthaginian assault. The carefully planned Roman battle formation, which had conquered nations and toppled empires, dissolved into chaos. Units lost contact with their commanders, officers collapsed from heatstroke, and the chain of command that held the Roman military machine together began to snap under the pressure. What had been an army became a mob. What had been soldiers became refugees, but perhaps the most devastating aspect of Xanthippus's strategy was how he used the Romans' own expectations against them. They had come expecting a glorious battle, a chance to prove their superiority and add another victory to Rome's legendary military record. Instead, they found themselves trapped in a nightmare where everything they knew about warfare had been turned upside down. The psychological impact of watching their mighty army crumble was perhaps more devastating than any physical wound. Roman soldiers who had never known defeat suddenly found themselves helpless, their training useless, their equipment more hindrance than help. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming, shattering not just their ability to fight, but their understanding of their own identity as invincible Roman legionnaires. As the day wore on and the casualties mounted, a horrible realization began to spread through the Roman ranks. They were not going to win this battle. They were not even going to survive it. The desert was going to claim them all, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. This knowledge spread like poison through their minds, completing the psychological destruction that Xanthippus had so carefully orchestrated. The Carthaginian general had achieved something that seemed impossible. He had made 86,000 Roman soldiers wish they had never been born. The combination of physical agony from the heat and psychological torment from their helpless situation created a form of suffering that went beyond anything they had experienced in previous battles. Roman soldiers began begging their own officers for permission to surrender, anything to escape the hellish conditions that Xanthippus had created. But surrender offered no relief, because the Spartan had planned for this too. He wanted Roman surrender, but he wanted it on his terms, in a way that would maximize the psychological impact and send a message that would echo across the Mediterranean. The terms of surrender that Xanthippus offered were designed to be more psychologically devastating than death itself. Roman soldiers would be spared, but only if they publicly acknowledged Carthaginian superiority, only if they renounced their loyalty to Rome, only if they agreed to serve as living examples of Roman weakness and Carthaginian strength. For proud Roman legionnaires who had built their entire identity around their service to the empire, these terms were torture beyond description. To live meant to betray everything they had ever believed in. To die meant to escape the shame but abandon their families and comrades. The choice itself was a form of psychological warfare more cruel than any physical torture. Many Romans chose death rather than dishonor, but even this choice played into Xanthippe's hands. Every Roman who chose to die rather than submit became a testament to the effectiveness of his psychological assault. Their death served as proof that he had broken them so completely that they preferred oblivion to the alternative he offered. But for those who chose to live, the psychological torment was just beginning. They were forced to watch as their comrades died around them, knowing that they had chosen shame over honor, survival over loyalty. The guilt and self-loathing that accompanied this choice became a prison more confining than any physical chains. Xanthippe had created a situation where there were no good choices, where every option led to psychological destruction. This was warfare elevated to the level of art, a masterpiece of human manipulation that would be studied and feared for generations to come. He had not just defeated a Roman army, he had redefined what it meant to achieve victory in battle. The physical conditions on the battlefield continued to deteriorate as the day reached its hottest point. The sand beneath the soldiers' feet became so hot that it burned through their sandals, adding another layer of agony to their suffering. The air itself seemed to shimmer with heat, creating mirages that taunted dying soldiers with visions of water that did not exist. Roman soldiers who had marched confidently onto the battlefield that morning now crawled across the burning sand, their pride forgotten, their training abandoned. Their only thought the desperate hope of finding shade or water or some relief from the torture that surrounded them. The transformation was complete. The masters of the Mediterranean had become beggars in the desert. The few Roman officers, who still maintained their sanity and authority, found themselves facing an impossible situation. They could order their men to continue fighting, but those men were physically and psychologically incapable of following such orders. They could order a retreat, but retreat was impossible in the trackless desert with an enemy that knew every inch of the terrain. They could order surrender, but the terms of surrender were designed to destroy everything that made them Roman. Regulus himself stood in the center of this chaos, watching his dreams of glory transform into a nightmare beyond imagination. The general, who had come to Africa to win immortal fame for himself and eternal glory for Rome, now faced the prospect of becoming the architect of Rome's most shameful defeat. The weight of this realization was crushing, adding psychological agony to the physical torment he shared with his soldiers. As the afternoon sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, it became clear that the battle was over, though the dying would continue for hours to come. Xanthippe had achieved the impossible. With 1,200 warriors, he had not just defeated, but utterly destroyed an army of 86,000 Romans. But more than that, he had created a new form of warfare that would haunt military commanders for centuries to come. The Carthaginian warriors moved through the battlefield with the methodical efficiency of undertakers, not killing for the sake of killing, but managing the psychological impact of every death, every surrender, every moment of Roman suffering. They had been trained not just as soldiers, but as instruments of psychological warfare, and they performed their role with terrifying precision. The survivors, who would eventually make it back to Rome, would carry with them more than just physical scars. They would carry the psychological wounds inflicted by Xanthippe's masterpiece of military psychology. They would never again feel the supreme confidence that had once defined Roman military culture. They would never again believe in their own invincibility. But perhaps the most lasting impact of this battle would be on military thinking itself. Xanthippe had demonstrated that numbers meant nothing if the enemy could control the conditions of battle. He had shown that psychological warfare could be more devastating than any physical assault. He had proven that a superior mind could overcome any material disadvantage. The reports that would eventually reach Rome would speak of heat stroke and difficult terrain, of tactical mistakes and bad luck. But those who had been there, who had experienced the full horror of Xanthippe's psychological assault, knew that they had witnessed something far more significant. They had seen the birth of a new form of warfare, one that attacked not just the body, but the very soul of the enemy. The 1,200 Carthaginian warriors had not just won a battle. They had redefined victory itself. They had shown that true conquest was not about occupying territory or killing enemies, but about breaking the spirit that made resistance possible. They had achieved something that would echo through military history. They had made their enemies beg for death as a mercy. As the sun finally began to set over the battlefield, painting the desert sky in shades of red that seemed to mirror the blood soaked into the sand, the full scope of Xanthippe's achievement became clear. He had not just saved Carthage from Roman conquest. He had created a legend that would inspire and terrify military commanders for generations to come. The surviving Romans who limped away from that battlefield carried with them a new understanding of warfare, one that acknowledged the power of psychology over brute force, of intelligence over numbers, of strategy over strength. They had learned that victory was not always measured in lives taken or territory conquered, but sometimes in the complete psychological destruction of the enemy's will to fight. The Battle of Tunis, as it would come to be known, represented more than just a military defeat for Rome. It represented a fundamental shift in how warfare itself was understood and conducted. Xanthippe had written the first chapter in a new book of military strategy, one that would influence commanders from Alexander to Napoleon to modern special forces. The psychological techniques that proved so devastating on that African battlefield would be studied, refined and employed by armies throughout history. The understanding that an enemy's mind was often more vulnerable than his body would become a cornerstone of military thinking. The recognition that environmental factors could be weaponized as effectively as swords and spears would revolutionize battlefield tactics. But beyond its military significance, this battle demonstrated something profound about human nature itself. It showed that the greatest weapon any warrior could possess was not physical strength or superior numbers, but the ability to understand and manipulate the psychological weaknesses of his enemies. It proved that the mind was the ultimate battlefield, and that victory belonged to whoever could control that space most effectively. The 86,000 Romans who had marched confidently onto that battlefield had believed in their own invincibility, their cultural superiority, their destiny to rule the world. Xanthippe had systematically destroyed each of these beliefs, leaving them psychologically naked and defenseless. In the face of forces they could not understand or combat, this psychological devastation was perhaps more complete and lasting than any physical destruction could have been. Physical wounds heal, physical losses can be replaced, but psychological trauma can last for generations. The Romans who survived this battle would carry its lessons with them for the rest of their lives. And those lessons would influence every military decision they ever made. The strategic implications were enormous. Rome, which had built its empire on the assumption of its own military superiority, suddenly faced the reality that there were enemies who could not be defeated through conventional means. This forced a fundamental re-evaluation of Roman military doctrine and strategy that would influence the empire's approach to warfare for centuries to come. The cultural impact was equally significant. Roman society, which had defined itself through military conquest and cultural superiority, suddenly faced evidence that there were other civilizations capable of matching or exceeding Roman achievements. This challenged the very foundation of Roman identity and forced a more nuanced understanding of their place in the world. For Carthage, the victory represented more than just survival. It represented vindication of their civilization and their way of life. They had proven that they could not only match Roman military prowess, but surpass it when properly led and strategically positioned. This gave them the confidence and credibility they needed to continue their struggle against Roman expansion. The figure of Xanthippus himself became legendary, representing the power of individual genius to change the course of history. His demonstration that a single brilliant mind could overcome seemingly impossible odds inspired military commanders and strategic thinkers for generations. He became the archetypal example of how intelligence and preparation could triumph over brute force and superior numbers. The techniques he pioneered on that African battlefield would be studied and adapted by armies throughout history. His understanding of environmental warfare, psychological manipulation, and the strategic use of enemy expectations would influence military thinking from ancient times to the modern era. Military academies would study his tactics, generals would attempt to emulate his methods, and strategists would build upon his innovations. The battle also demonstrated the crucial importance of understanding and adapting to local conditions. Xanthippus had succeeded where others failed because he took the time to understand the African environment and turn it to his advantage. This lesson about the importance of environmental adaptation would become a fundamental principle of military strategy. The psychological aspects of his victory were equally important for future military thinking. He had shown that an enemy's expectations could be turned into weapons against them, that confidence could be transformed into vulnerability, that superior numbers could become a liability under the right conditions. These insights would revolutionize approaches to asymmetric warfare and inspire unconventional military strategies for centuries to come. The human cost of the battle was staggering, but its historical significance was even greater. It marked a turning point not just in the conflict between Rome and Carthage, but in the evolution of warfare itself. It demonstrated that the future belonged not to those with the largest armies or the most advanced weapons, but to those who best understood the psychology of conflict and the art of strategic thinking. The legacy of that one day of agony in the African desert would echo through military history, inspiring innovations in psychological warfare, environmental strategy, and asymmetric tactics that continue to influence military thinking to this day. Xanthippus had not just won a battle. He had changed the nature of war itself, proving that the greatest victories were won not through superior force, but through superior understanding of the human mind and its vulnerabilities. The 1,200 Carthaginians had achieved something that 86,000 Romans could not. They had made their mark on history through intelligence, preparation, and psychological insight, rather than brute force and numerical superiority. In doing so, they had written one of the most important chapters in the evolution of military strategy and demonstrated that in warfare, as in life, the mind is the ultimate weapon.